Things you learn from Christian history number 6. All reforming movements end up needing reform. Variant: holy men are nearly always in some way betrayed by some of their followers. Nearly all reforming movements end up as part of the establishment. The Benedictines became wealthy. Francis of Assisi was remembered in an enormous basilica erected by the Franciscans. The Puritans fled persecution and then ended up persecuting others. Moral lessons here. Chapter 6. Crusaders, Cathedrals and Cathars. Going medieval. Some rather smug 17th century historians looked back on the period between the fall of Rome and the rediscovery of classical culture and named it the Middle Ages. A kind of pause, an interval, marking time between, the real action. The word medieval is even more recent. It was coined in the mid-19th century to make the phrase Middle Ages sound posher. But for all the mud and blood and superstition and squalor, the Middle Ages have a rich and unmistakably Christian culture. They invented the Crusades, yes, but they also built cathedrals. There were bad popes and patriarchs, but some brilliant peasants. Because for all the officially sanctioned nastiness and brutality, this was a time when ordinary men and women started to reclaim a bit of holiness for themselves. By the middle of the 11th century, Christianity had spread from the Celts in the far northwest to the Nestorians in the far east. And despite all the theological squabbles, there was a lot of common experience. A Christian from Britain who went to Constantinople would not have understood much of the language, and in the long-standing tradition of its people, would certainly have complained about the weather and the food. But he would still have found a lot to recognise in the church. There was the calendar. Advent and Lent and Easter and Christmas were common to all. The week had a common pattern too, with fasting on Friday and Sabbath on Sunday. In 1017 it was decreed that princes, nobles and knights were to desist from all warfare from Saturday to Monday, and during the holy seasons of Lent and Advent. Any soldier who fought during these times would be denied the last rites, Christian burial and forgiveness for his sins. There were feast days and holy days, celebrations of local saints or commemorating events, real or imagined, in the life of Jesus and Mary. Such holy days were important in lives that were, for the most part, sheer, unremitting, hard grind. And some of these days adapted previous pagan festivals, which allowed the faithful to keep links with their past. Rogation Tide is a Catholic day of prayer for a good harvest. It replaced the pagan festival of Robigalia. Excuse me. They usually come in twos. The pagan festival of Robigalia, which was a fertility festival. In church, though, things were slightly less accessible for the ordinary Christian. Everybody went to Mass, but the Mass wasn't given to everybody. Worshippers received the bread, but not the wine, a tradition stemming from a superstitious literalism. Since the wine was thought to become the blood of Christ, priests couldn't take the risk of spilling it, so only the priest drank the wine. And there were barriers. The Western liturgy was still in Latin, a language few people understood, sometimes not even the ones saying the words. And in the churches, there was a literal barrier, a screen that separated them from where the priests did their stuff. For the ordinary Christian, it was definitely not access all areas. And there was a growing feeling that things should change. The hinges. One of those who wanted change, albeit not perhaps of quite the same kind as your man in the pew, not that they had pews yet, was a man called Hildebrand. Hildebrand, died in 1085, was a former Cluniac monk who, though from a humble background, became the most powerful and influential figure in the papal administration. He was behind the election of several popes, whom he used to carry forward his plans for reform. First up for reform was the manner of choosing a pope. In 1059, Hildebrand and his supporters pushed through reforms which meant that from then on the pope would be elected by the College of Cardinals. The word cardinal comes from the Latin cardo, hinge. The name was first given to the parish priests of the 28 significant churches in Rome who were pivotal. Everything hinged around them. Gradually, they formed a college, a group that soon ranked second in precedence to the Pope himself. From now on, the choice of a new pope would hinge on the hinges. The Western emperor was only 9 when this decision was taken. Henry IV, 1050 to 1106, grew into a wild, uncontrollable youth with a reputation for viciousness. A teenager, as we now call them. One thing he wasn't wild about was this method of choosing the Pope. In Henry's eyes, that was the job of the Emperor, not the cardinals. He decided to show the church he was boss by choosing the next Archbishop of Milan. At the time, the city was in turmoil because of the rise of a radical reforming party called the Cathars. The name is a typically sneering elitist put-down. It means rag pickers, the lowliest workers in the cloth trade. The Cathars were ordinary workers, lower-class laity, who hated the wealth and privilege of the church. They wanted reform. One of their radically dangerous ideas was that archbishops should actually be Christian. The Archbishop of Milan, Guido da Velate, was illiterate, sold church positions to the highest bidder, and lived with a number of concubines. The Catharian leader, Ariald, formed a community composed of independent priests who were no longer going to obey such archbishops, as well as laymen and women. They gave away their possessions, lived under a common rule, and embraced chastity. Ariald even began appointing his own alternative clergy. The response was swift and brutal. In 1067 he was killed by thugs employed by the Davelati family, and his body dumped in Lake Como. His followers were enraged. When Guido died in 1071, they put forward their own candidate, who had the approval of Pope Alexander and, more importantly, of Cardinal Hildebrand, who was more or less operating the Pope by remote control. Henry blocked their choice, and fighting broke out between the two sides. The Cathedral of Milan was burnt down. Then, in the middle of all this kerfuffle, Pope Alexander died. Hildebrand had now run out of puppet popes, so was forced to do the job himself. So in 1073 he changed his name, hardly surprising for someone called Hildebrand, and became Pope Gregory VII. Before we charge on with Gregory, it's worth pausing a moment for the Cathars. Here we see the first flowering of the heretic reforming movements of the 12th century. Because the Catharian movement didn't stick at Milan, the Catharian was burned as a heretic at Cambrai in France in 1077. Actually, the problem for the church was that the Catharian movement didn't stop at all. The Catharians wanted proper root and branch reform, a contemporary church that reflected the radical Christianity of the apostles. They were Christians who wanted real Christianity.